Good morning, everybody. A formal welcome once again to all of you for making it to this day 2 of our IEA Madras chapter conference. And we look forward to a very immersive session today on exciting topics with speakers who will enlighten us on whatever has been charted out for the 1-hour programs. So this is the RNG, Risk and Governance Track 1. And in the first session today, we have Mr. Arjun Rajagopal, who will be taking us through on a topic which I think has attracted attention amongst most of the participants, being a special topic called the Millennial Fraudster and New Age Deception. So there was a small disappointment which I could sense in Arjun's voice, that he himself is a millennial, and therefore to be talking about millennial fraudsters, are we trying to put them in a special bucket and probably try to understand a person or give them a special color, which is actually not to be, or the intention. Intention is that the millennial fraudsters, which I'm sure he will dwell in detail, it's not to discuss their persona or try and understand what is it that they do, but the reason for calling out a millennial fraudster is that the scale and the reach and the creativity with which fraudsters currently attack or carry out their attacks, that really is the intention of the topic. Millennial or otherwise, it's not that people who are not millennials are not creative enough. The reach of these frauds has taken mind-boggling proportions. So that was the idea behind the topic. Now moving on to Mr. Arjun and his profile, we extend a warm welcome to Mr. Arjun. He is a partner and an executive committee member, strategy and transaction services at Deloitte Touche. And he is an experienced partner with a demonstrated history of working across geographies and industries, skilled in business process improvement, blue ocean consulting, technology consulting, risk consulting, and financial advisory. In his current role as a partner, he is focused on forensic and dispute and leads Southern India region, MEA corridor, and the telecom sector. He is currently the clients and industries leader for financial advisory business, and has been part of the Young Partner Advisory Council that is nominated every year by the leadership to assist them in the firm level strategy. So welcome, Mr. Arjun, and we look forward to a very immersive session.
Good morning, all of you. So one slight change, I think I've changed my rules now a little bit, so I don't focus on the growth or what you call as CNI. I focus on what you call as people, experience and talent. And as a part of the talent, my biggest issue which we're dealing with is not millennials, it's now Gen Zs. We're dealing with a lot of Gen Zs, and therefore we're dealing with a lot of issues and their perceptions about how they deal with office and also the other parts which comes along with that. So as ma'am rightly said, this topic was obviously a topic which was given to me, and we had a lot of internal debate, discussion about is this the right topic at all or not, and then they gave me the flexibility of changing the topic and said do whatever you want to, right? Just come here and present whatever you want to about fraud surveys, but this is what we thought of, and we're just reflecting upon what the entire genesis of this particular topic could be, right? So first, obviously, the reaction was that, but idea was to look at it in more detail and figure out that what is it that we are going to achieve out of the entire session, and define what does a particular fraudster profile look like. So therefore, that's what is the context. And as she said, I am myself a millennial, so I don't think so I'm a fraudster yet. So how many millennials in the room? Okay, so let me just ask the first question. How many understand what is a millennial? Who is a millennial? Can anybody answer? After 1981, right? So which essentially means anybody who's a 44-year should be a millennial by now. So are there enough millennials in the rooms then? Now everybody can raise their hands. I think a lot more will raise their hands now. Perfect. So the first part which I want to start off is that have the understanding of what does a millennial mean, because at least even I didn't know, because we've been saying these kids, these millennials, and suddenly realized that I'm also a millennial. So that was the first thing which hit me strong. So I'll start with that. I can't see the screen. So can I take a mic? So when we look at the age bar for a millennial, it is very broad. It is not like the youngsters so far, that's Gen Z now. Hello? So we are technically talking about millennial who's aged between 29 to 40s, middle people who are now reasonably experienced 10 to 12 years or more than that number of years of experience. What is more important here is that when we think about millennial, we are actually talking about people who have a lot of interactions in terms of the digital world, in terms of having access to multiple platforms which are in the areas of, say, e-commerce, which are in the areas of crypto, NFT, wallets, which are all something which they are exposed to or we are all exposed to. So that is one thing which changes. The other part which changes is that they are shaped by certain events of financial crisis, right, which has resulted into a different kind of economy, which is called gig economy, and the tech startup boom. So when the tech startup boom, they are more exposed to different kinds of technologies, and therefore they are more aware of how a technology has to be used. The third is obviously we are talking about the first digital native generation with deep familiarity with the financial ecosystem. So now we have access to a lot of information in the ecosystem which is digitally driven, and many of my transaction today is dealt with digitally, and therefore the identity of the particular person may not be known. So we are talking about an ecosystem where all of us are interacting with each other but may not have even met each other. So that's the world in which we are all living, and therefore most of the millennials have been brought up in that particular environment. They wouldn't have seen the other side of the environment which was prior to the digitization. Now, what drives a fraud in any fraudster, right? So there is a fraud triangle. All of us understand about it. But if I'm looking at it from a lens of a person who's now more tech-enabled, more capable, what does it mean as a fraud triangle, right? Many of it would be common, and that's what we wanted to drive, that any fraudster's mindset, millennial, non-millennial, would remain the same. There will always be a motivation, there will always be a rationale, and there will always be a, what you call as an opportunity for him or her to do a fraud. Now, when I look at the opportunity, high digital literacy, technology adoption in the value chain, digital nomadism, which essentially means that he can sit at any remote location and he can still have access to information in place. We are talking about adoption of the technology across value chain, which means in the business today, while some parts of the business were disconnected and working in silos, today everything is integrated businesses, right from your vendor, third parties, to your internal data, right from sales to your supply chain. All of them are interrelated and integrated in the digital form. So if I have access to it, I can inflict a lot more bigger fraud compared to maybe what he or she would have done if he didn't have access to independent siloed data points. The other is obviously we are all aware of being digital, and therefore the literacy rates are higher. So that's a part of opportunity. When you're looking at the motivation, right? Economic instability, it's the same for any fraudster, be it millennial, non-millennial. We are talking about cost of living and wealth gaps. Gig economy of side hustles. I think side hustles could be that I'm sitting idle here. I have 5 hours of work which I do. I still have 3 hours which I can spend. Let me work with somebody else. Let me do some moonlighting. That's one example. There could be many other examples as well. Or let me try out some cryptocurrency. Let me try out some kind of a hanky-panky in terms of getting into the network. So those are the things which leads to this. Then we are talking about attention seeking. This is something which I would say millennial or the younger part of the millennial, and also people who are, say, the Gen Zs today, they really want an attention. When they are into the organization, they really want to have a meaningful work and they want the attention. Now, how do I get my attention? I can do great work and get the attention. The other way is that I can do some knee-jerk reaction and still get the attentions. So that's been something which has been very prominently coming out as well. You've seen people who are sitting in call center, who are great guys, a lot of intelligence, but they're doing work which is not very relevant to them. They suddenly start exploring how can I induce a ransomware attack into the ecosystem as well, and they learn about it. There are a lot of access to ChatGPT to figure out how they can do that as well, and they will do it only to seek attention, or only for the purpose of thrill to overcome boredom. The other thing is obviously we are talking about don't associate with the company. Because you're working in an environment where I'm just working in silos in many of the organizations, not all of them, the kind of bonding as a family is not there. So the association or the loyalty which earlier people used to have with the organization is not there. It is very transactional, it is very KPI driven, which means that I have a disassociation, and therefore the reason for me to potentially do a fraud, and I don't mind it. Then we are talking about rationale. Again, we talked about boredom here. Everyone else is doing it, which is any fraudsters biggest alibi that they will talk about. Everyone does it, so am I. Easy money making scheme, lack of recognition, which again somewhere attention seeking and lack of recognition somewhere relates to each other. And then we are talking about social media and lifestyle pressures. We've seen cases very recently in especially the startups where one example was that they were doing a circular transaction to take away money from the organization. And the way that they were trying to do is that manipulate the supply side of the story and say I'm paying it to the vendor and then bring it back to the customer side and show that I've made a payment and show that particular transaction. And in the process, they eat a margin and take out money. While the genuine transaction never happened. And it was running into multiple crores. When we asked him what was the reason, he was saying that he started betting, started playing into gamings, and in the gamings we started getting to the bettings. I got a kick out of that particular part. And because I started losing later, I had to probably figure out a way of making money so that I can probably cover up for that particular losses. So therefore he started doing these particular frauds. So it started with something which is more of a social pressure to something that he ended up doing frauds in his own ecosystem. Now this is what we are trying to understand, that what does my profile of a fraudster look like, and this is based on, most of them are based on say ACFA reports, and some of them is also based on the Deloitte fraud survey. We carry out a Deloitte fraud survey every 2 years, and it cuts across about 500 CXOs, various industries, various kinds of industry, I would say startup to something which is more mature, brick and mortar IT. So from there we picked up what has been the profile. It more or less matches. So if you look at the profile, the age, less than, if you look at it, more than 2/3 of the fraudsters about 30 to 50 years of age, which is slightly more than a millennial, and some part of them is a part of the millennial as well. When I break this further, you will realize that less than 30, the median losses is about $50,000. The age group, which is the typical millennial, slightly more, it's about $136,000. And more than 50, it's $350,000. So the more you are in the organization, the more the ability for you to inflict a bigger fraud. And therefore, the more impact that you create. So that was one of the reference point. The other part which talked about is the fact that, and this is where you are talking about organizations, right? So one is the age, but it is not the age which is making him do better. It is about the fact that they know the system better, they know their companies better, they know the loopholes in the companies better, and therefore they're able to inflict a much more higher and a bigger fraud as well. And that somewhere gets triggered from 2-3 things. One is that he never started with an intent of doing a fraud, but somewhere in the journey, they found an opportunity gate and therefore they wanted to leverage the particular gate, or the lack of recognition around that particular part from the organization, and he felt that I have given so much to the company, but I'm not getting back, and therefore they may get into that. But large part is that unless and until they know the organization, they can't do a fraud. Unless and until they are able to collude, that's when the fraud suddenly increases more. So you would see that most of the organizations, when there are bigger frauds happening, it's a fraud scheme. It will not be one guy doing one fraud. It will be a scheme of collusion that may happen with the vendor, it may happen with their own subordinates or a different department for them to come together and do a fraud, which is what is reflected here as a part of our analysis, that the fraud impact goes up 3 times if there are collusions which are happening. Collusions are most likely when there are 2 people, 3 people who are working in the ecosystem for a longer time, and therefore they can trust each other. The other part which has come out clearly is that the more you're educated, the more likelihood of you can inflict a bigger fraud as well. Not that every guy who's educated is a fraudster, but I'm saying the likelihood of impacting a fraud is higher if you're more educated, which is again 2/3 of the fraudsters are more literate. So which again takes us to the point that today the millennials that we are referring to are people who are educated, who are literate, and who are able to understand the systems and the data and therefore inflict frauds. Anywhere we have seen frauds happening, people have spent time in understanding process, data, and how to circumvent as well. They've gone to that extent. There is one example I was quoting from, say, a gold company. I don't want to name the company. And there is one guy who started very small in the organization. He was doing a work which is a basic work. His take home could be not more than 30,000-40,000 a month, and he's been there in the system for close to about 14 years. When you meet him, he'll be one of the most friendly, docile, quiet guy. and his job was to manage the entire whatever operations in terms of identifying jewelries which are not as per the design and send it back for melting and reject the jewelries. If it is rejected, it's sent to the melting. Now he understood that how much of a percentage losses can happen if you melt a jewelry, and therefore those losses are not accounted for. And he also understood the process that when I create certain kind of exits and gate pass, what records are not captured between two different places. So one is exit from one place, entry to the other place. He knew that there is a gap in terms of record keeping over there. And basis these two understanding itself, right? It has nothing to do with technology, but he understood the process. He was able to take out gold to the tune of 34 crores. Simple understanding of the process and simple understanding of how a melting process works and how much is the losses which goes unaccounted for. Again, millennial, but is it techie? No, correct? But is this the reason that millennial, therefore he is able to do it? No, it's just time spent in the organization and understanding the gaps as well. So this is one example I wanted to quote. The other part which is important here is, I think I didn't touch upon this. Whenever there's an employee doing a fraud, the quantum of loss is lesser and instances are also lesser because they fear the manager, they fear the owner. When he or she becomes a manager, the level of fear is slightly lesser because he understands how it works, and therefore the extent of frauds are higher, and therefore you'll see the contributions. And whenever it's an owner, and which is what is very, very prominent today, when we look at the startup ecosystem today, today's almost 60% of investigation is directed towards startup and founders over there. And that's largely happening because of the fact that they are, maybe one of the reasons and rationale given is that they're under the pressure of demonstrating a consistent growth, consistent revenue to the investor. So that is their rationale to potentially do a fraud. But eventually they're also making their money because they are going to exit at some point in time where the valuation is going to be higher. But the way it comes out is that there's a lot of pressure for me to show a revenue, and therefore I indulge into a fraud to demonstrate a revenue which was never generated as well. But again, the point is the loss is much more higher, predominantly because of the fact that he can do a management overrides. He can influence the people around him and get things done. So therefore, the losses are higher over there. Now these are some of the fraud survey results where we're talking about where does my fraud losses happen, which department, which area contributes to my fraud losses. You would see that information technology is fast growing and the trend is only increasing further and further. There are 17% of the contribution of frauds today happens through information technology, and therefore the fraudsters who are tech savvy are able to inflict a higher fraud over there. But what is more interesting here is that other than that, if you look at procurement, if you look at vendor, if you look at sales, all of them are traditional fraud which still continues to be the most volume-based frauds, I would say, unlike what we think. The general perception is that the tech-enabled frauds is on a rise, which is true. But today, the bigger problem is still lies with the traditional frauds of supply chain, traditional frauds of sales, traditional fraud of procurements, vendor favoritism, kickback still continues to be a big problem. It's just that the nature of or the modus operandi of doing a fraud may suddenly change as the technology evolves as well. We've seen cases where I'm making a bank statement payment or I'm asked to make a payment to a different account by making some changes into the bank account details. This can happen because there is no controls over there. This can also happen because the CFO has got an instruction from, say, his boss sitting in, say, a European country, and that is over a video call which was deep-faked. So the extent of changes can be very different, but eventually he's actually done a fraud of probably making a payment to a different bank account. Now this again is one of the indicators about what are the contributors for the particular fraud from a lens of categories which are there. If you look at the contributions, cyber tops the list, which is close to about 20% of the contributions coming from the cyber. You would see a contribution which is coming from artificial intelligence and related technologies, which is growing, and it is significantly growing. So it's about 8.26 as on probably last year. What we see is that almost 43% of your current work in any organization is going to be replaced with AI-related technologies, or it may be leveraged in some form or shape. In fact, if I look at some form or shape and individual people using AI, it is going to be close to about 69%. So effectively, all organizations are going to undergo this particular change of enabling their workplace into an AI-enabled workplace, which means that the fraud which is related to this, it's going to extensively go up because of the fact that you'll have much more bigger avenues for you to do a fraud. So as on today itself, it is about 30 to 40% which is IT enabled. As we progress, the contribution of IT related frauds will increase, and therefore the people and millennials who are now knowing about these particular technologies can do a fraud, and same way the millennials who know about this can also put the governance around that particular part. Now this talks about what are the root causes of it. If you look at that, I think 20% of it is because of that limited understanding of what fraud can hit you and what are the emerging trends in the frauds, because we don't update our knowledge. We know about some traditional fraud scenarios and we continue to think about those as well. But as we progress, as we adopt more technology, as my businesses change, the nature of fraud also will evolve, and therefore we need to be ready. Today, if I'm doing a process in a manual way, I will have a checks and balance of what we call as maker and checker. The moment I automate it, I believe everything is sorted, and therefore maker checker is forgotten. But what we need to understand is that while the person behind it was a manual guy, now it's automated, but we still need to ensure that that particular automation also has got a maker checker governance to be put in place. So I'm only replacing a human with a humanoid, but the humanoid should have a governance as well. So the root cause over here is largely talking about that. The second one is obviously static dated internal control, which is what we were referring to, that we need to constantly upgrade it. The third one is interesting, disproportionate access to information system decision making. This is changing fast, because when we were referring to this, we were referring to the person who's got access to these informations today, which was a human person in the organization whom I know. I can say that Preyas is the one who's doing this job and he should have got lesser information access, he's got more. But the moment I define that into a bot or into an AI kind of a rule, right, what does it mean in terms of governance of who's got access? That has to be defined. If I don't define that, this particular contribution will significantly increase to maybe a 50% in the next time when we do a survey. Now this is again a different aspect of what all contributes to the future frauds. The remote working arrangement is going to contribute to a large part of the future frauds because the face behind the fraud is not known. That's one part of it. I would want to extend this further to say that this is not only about the employee working from remotely, it is also the vendor third party working remotely. That's one part of it. And also imagine we are talking about a connected eco world where all your customer transaction interfacing today is also very much digital in nature. So therefore you will not know who's interacting with you, you will not know who's impacting or who's having access to your information, and therefore that becomes a larger issue or a concern here. Now, what we try to do is that we try to understand that how a particular fraud scenarios has evolved over a period of time. So, traditionally, which is early 2000, which we were still millennials, but maybe we were in colleges, the kinds of fraud which were happening was Ponzi schemes, we had pyramids, we were talking about identity thefts, which is mostly manual, which is like an account takeover. I may have impersonated, given somebody else's documentations as well. Insider frauds and bribery, and we are talking about counterfeit goods. These are the ones, obviously there could be many frauds, but these are the ones which were more prominent in the early 2000s. As we progress to a decade later, the kinds of fraud, because we became more digital, we became more networked, the kinds of fraud changed from physical impersonation to more of a digital impersonation, which is where we had phishing frauds, online scams like advertising scams became much more prominent. Loyalties, wastages and abuse on the network in the offering programs happened. Credit card fraud picked up the maximum during this particular period because obviously the governance and understanding that this could go wrong was lesser. And then we were talking about data breaches. And this is where I think many of you, if you're an IT company, you'll know that VAPT, vulnerability assessments and all those things came in. I think DLP also came in during this particular period because that's what leading to at least some bit of a control and governance over the cyber part of it. But largely it was external attack and it was not more internal. So here it was internal frauds. Here it was internal plus newer thing which has come in. The older thing still continued, but newer thing came in further as well, which was again more external, more customer, more not knowing about who's doing it. Then this is where we have changed. So once we put controls in place today about ensuring that my ecosystem has got firewalls, has got access controls, has got information securities in place, things change even more drastically here because one, there was an implosion of data access. As I said, integrated informations, data, customer giving their own data outs, customer being more engaging on the social networks, and therefore they are able to give out a lot more information about themselves, which was made use of by the people to do more complex phishing frauds over there. So this is where we started seeing deep fake and AI generated frauds coming up, but it is just about starting now. We are talking about bot-driven automated social engineering, like a SIM farming. So if you look at most of the fraud which is happening today, especially around the payment side of it, it requires you to give some identity, and those identities are driven by either PAN card or Aadhaar or say SIMs, which will identify, or devices, which is going to identify them. So this is the place where people have started doing SIM farming, they've started doing PAN farming, and therefore give information which can be used for you to impersonate. Then obviously ransomware attack and cyber extortions are on a rise, and this is much more organized than what it was earlier. Earlier it was like a brute force where I just make some multiple attempts and I get lucky and I get in. But here it is a much more structured way where you're getting into it. It's like a sleeper cell. It is there sitting in your system, noticing about how every person is behaving, noticing the process flow to figure out that who's doing what kind of forms comes in, what kind of questions are asked. And once it understands the entire process, then it inflicts the particular part of data access, information access, or maybe DOS attacks, or probably take out information and send out instructions saying that I can generate instruction from my own mailbox and send out and say, okay, make payment to 20 people, and the other guy who sees instruction ends up making a payment. But for that to happen, they spend time inside the network to understand how things are happening in my business. Now, what's my future fraud looking like? Some of it is an extension of 2022 that we are talking about. One is it's invasive deepfake incidents, which can lead to market manipulations. IoT vulnerabilities. I'm sure I don't need to explain this. IoTs are a part of all of our lives now, right from your home appliances to you're talking about cars to say life sciences. It's there. So basic thing is that it is about a way where devices are connected with each other. Today I will know what is my car's current condition. The information goes back and somebody is able to come back and services better. My tire pressures would be known to me, and therefore from there on I should be able to get instruction about what's my quality of tire. So it is used for various purposes. Pacemakers are monitored constantly to figure out is there anything which is maybe the health of the pacemaker is assessed well. So these are some of the examples of IoTs. I'm sure there are many use cases, but these are all retail use cases. Google Drives, we are talking about cars, driverless cars. Now imagine this instruction today is only going one way, which is essentially the information which is about the condition of the particular device or a car goes for servicing. If the instruction can come the other direction, then I can actually do one instruction and every car can go haywire, right? One instruction, every pacemaker can go haywire. One instruction, all the tires can burst. So that's a risk that we're dealing with today. And therefore, what are the mitigation mechanism is something that needs to be looked at, and that's where the millennials are also working towards. Biometric spoofing. So today my identity was signatures, then it came to some other access cards, then it turned into biometric, which can be facial, retina, thumb impressions. Now we are seeing that all of them could also be spoofed and emulated using AI, and therefore there's a risk for me to do a fraud by using these spoofing mechanisms. Now, AI is used in a big way to make decisions and make opinions. if I'm able to induce a bias into the AI, means what I'm getting as a recommendation from AI may be a colored recommendation which may not be necessarily the true reflection of the facts. How can that happen if I'm training the model in that particular direction and influencing it? It's like brainwashing a guy. The other part is that the sources to which I'm referring to, those sources are something which are the reliable sources or not. If those sources are also fed with wrong data, it's going to lead to a bias again. So these are all something which is happening now. It has already started happening, where the outputs of the particular AI is either hallucination or a bias. In a judgment in a court today also, the organization, the law firm, some of the law firms started using references and quotations from what happened in some other judgment somewhere else. And there were instances identified very recently where the judgment that was given as a reference was itself an incorrect reference, and therefore all the other arguments which was around that fell apart. So those are the things that we need to watch out for. While it has a great use cases, and which is why millennials are using all those use cases today, but it can also be used to probably inflict a bias and therefore influence the decision which can be done either at the public level or at probably a corporate level as well. I just want to play this out. I'm sure some of you would have seen this.
Hello, everyone. I'm here to tell you about the Neuralink crypto token, the new cryptocurrency that will change the world forever. With this token, you have a unique opportunity to invest in the future of brain-machine interfaces. We're developing cutting-edge technology that will allow humans to communicate directly with computers using their minds. And then that's not all. We're also exploring the possibility of connecting human brains to the internet. Imagine the possibilities from remote learning to telepathy to curing diseases. By investing in the Neuralink crypto token, you'll be a part of this revolution. And the earlier you invest, the greater your potential returns will be. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and it won't last long. So don't wait. Invest in the Neuralink crypto token today and join us on our mission to enhance the human experience.
Who has seen this video? Anybody has seen this video? Yes. I think there are a lot of similar videos even happening in India as well. The CEO's announcements are being done. Well, it may not be true. Now, we've also recently come across a case where the CEO gave an instruction to the CFO saying that I want you to, we are launching, it's okay.
Hello, everyone. I'm here to tell you.
Yeah. So I think this is one of them, but it's happened in India as well. Finance workers pays about $25 million after video call with the fake chief financial officer. This happened even in India very recently, where the CEO, global CEO, called up the CFO locally in India. In fact, he was a financial controller. He said that we see a lot of potential in you, and I want to make you a CFO. And that's the starting of the conversation. Then he encouraged him a lot, and he knew a lot about that particular financial controller. And then what he said is that we are launching a new company and an entity in India, and keep it to yourself, don't tell anybody, because this is extremely confidential. But we need to start investing on it. So please take out this much amount of money or whichever banks that they had in, and start transferring to a different account, because we need to deal with it in a very confidential manner. They also involved the auditors in this entire thing, and they said this is the auditor who's going to work with you. And there was one of the big four name also mentioned over there. That was also beautifully created. Every domain ID, everything was thought through as well. The names of the partners were known over there. So every familiarity was known. So they had actually kept the bot to understand what exactly happens in the ecosystem. And this entire video was actually a deep fake video. He did not understand that, and obviously the trigger point is that he was aspiring to become a CFO, and he started with that particular tone, so he was anyway sold. So, and after that he didn't even think about the fact that there's a SOP in place. I'm not supposed to make a payment without a delegation authority which has to be approved. I'm not supposed to take out to an account which is not even known. So he overrode all the rules because there is a CEO who's told him, who's encouraged him, and is looking at him as a CFO for the next entity, which was obviously non-existent as well. And eventually, obviously, the transaction did take place, the money got lost, it went into some kind of a Hawala chain, so the traceability was difficult. And obviously the financial controller lost his job, no matter how much he convinced that it was based on instruction, but the damage was done. Again, the point was that it was a combination of bot, which was sitting in the system to understand how exactly the CFO does his work, or the financial controller, and two, the deep fakes. Very similar to what is mentioned here. And Indians were ahead of the curve. I think $25 million was a lesser value compared to what the Indians inflicted in this case. This is another example of cryptocurrency issue where there was a hacking which happened, and obviously the loss was to the extent of $1.4 billion. So which is where we are saying that while the traditional frauds happens more, and that still continues to be one of the issues for the organization to deal with, but when a fraud like a cyber attack happens, the extent of impact could be far more bigger, and therefore the governance around that becomes extremely important. In this specific case, while we are talking about external attack and information and technologies, the key part here was that somebody inside who was sitting here was the one who was responsible and reasonable for this. He knew what exact controls were put in place, and therefore he worked towards ensuring that those gates could be circumvented. Now, Medusa ransomware is an organized kind of cartel in itself, I would say. In fact, they call themselves as services. What they do is that they take data, or they're able to probably steal the data, keep it with them. They'll call you and they will say that if you don't pay me this money, I'm going to make it public. And these are all customer sensitive data, and therefore if it goes public, it has a huge repercussion both on the customers and their consumers. At the same time, it also has a repercussion on the company, and therefore the company ends up giving the ransomware. So it was a very organized way of doing it, and it impacted multiple companies in that particular period which was there. I'm sure many of you would have at least heard about this. Now, it again brings back to some of the examples that I was quoting about what are the risks which are evolving, which are slightly different, and which is inflicted by the so-called millennials, and I would probably extend that to Gen Zs now, because they are much more aware and much more adept to dealing with AI. So one is a typical security risk, which can lead to financial losses. It can lead to a IP theft, and that is largely happening because of some of the understanding gaps about the governance issues also, right? I today make use of AI. I'm not saying that many of you do it, but there are people who end up doing that as well. I today have a query that I need to put it into my ChatGPT and to get some answers. When I put that particular query, am I putting the query which is generic, or am I putting a query which has some information which may be potentially confidential information about me or about the organization? The moment I'm putting informations into that to make it more specific and more precise, to get my answers better, or make my presentation better, or make my insights better, I end up giving more information to this, and sometimes the ChatGPT or the equivalent will probe you as well, correct? So if you start leaking or giving informations hoping that's going to give you more precise informations, you're also letting out your informations into the network, correct? So that can lead to a potential financial losses. It can lead to IP theft. Now, trust and safety is the other risk we are talking about, where we are talking about you get a convincing phishing emails, you can get deepfakes, misinformations, and we spoke about this as an example we showed as well. The entire idea is that today AI can enable me to get more convincing conversation so that I can believe that whom I'm talking to is the right person as well, and he knows about me and I know him. So that conviction is happening because of enablement of AI technology, which is where the Gen Zs and say some of the parts of millennials are actually able to do that because they understand how to do that better. Now, we are talking about the privacy risk. The same as the security risk, the privacy risk lies more on the information pertaining to the personal data. That was more pertaining to the confidential data of the company. This is more personal data, but both of them have very different implications on the overall company as well as the individuals. The data risk, this is the one which is very, very interesting, especially for the corporates. When any of the IA/compliance teams is working on in their companies today, how many of you are compliance IA people? I'm assuming many of you would be, but so okay, I can see only less hands. Are you guys involved in the entire AI implementation journeys? Can anybody raise hands if they're involved in the implementation journeys? Okay. So, would you want to share some experience about that, sir, about implementation of the AI?
Okay. I'm T.R. Rajesh. Just wanted to give you some perspective. Okay, this is an organization. We developed a very, very AI, ML and based tool. One of the biggest challenge, initially developing the code was okay because we had lots of people and who are developing the tools. But when it comes to the implementation, how did you literally evaluate the transparency and the ethical way of gathering the information was one of the biggest challenge. How do you ensure that you are meeting all the data privacy requirements and you are not literally using the data for training purpose? What are the data which you can use it for the training? At the end of the day, it is what you input is what the outcome. And that is what the ML and the AI finally does it for us. Hence, using the ethical, unbiased way of collecting the data with the transparency and with meeting all the consent requirements was a bigger risk for the organization. But at the end of the day, yes, and we had to go through lots of crunching and anonymization, lots of other data crunching, and to ensuring that we have the right data ingested to get the right inputs. So that's very nutshell, but there are lots to speak on that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think this is what I wanted to kind of echo. So I think we've still not started on the journey of realizing that the risk management team and an IA team has got a very uphill task going forward, because it's not about auditing, say 10 transactions, 20 transactions, 100 transactions, and then have an audit cycle, look at some of the process, do some audits, process gaps. I think the world is changing over there, because the moment I'm talking about enabling things with AI, it is not about transactions anymore. And when you're talking about shifting it to the second line of defense, first line of defense, the event has already happened. It is not about people anymore. So extremely important that one, all of us are AI aware. We understand how AI works. What kind of a contribution is it going to do to any businesses, and how is it going to impact? I think that's important to understand, challenge that, and it should be a part of your program to validate the source of the AI or challenge the source of the AI and challenge the model which is going to be used, because change in the model, change in the source can lead to incorrect results, incorrect decisions, and that impact is much more bigger than your audit findings today in the procure to pay process and what's going to happen as a part of, say, if there are 3 quotations not taken. So therefore, extremely important that as AI professionals, as IA professionals, as risk management professionals, there is at least a sense of urgency in all of us to ensure that we go back to the management and say that whenever AI implementation is happening, we need to have a role to play. You can start with at least questioning as a logical person, then you can increase your ability to understand AI more and go in that particular journey and be more AI aware. Because that's the key change which is going to happen, which is where the millennials, some of us are millennials, so we should be tech savvy. So, but otherwise the other millennial on the other side of it, they may actually impact the organization much more bigger and in a much more wider or broader way as well. Now, this is some of the, I would say, pillars of how do I deal with AI, and the subject is not about AI. Why we are saying this today is that there is a need for a millennial to look at things differently and use this tech savviness to look at future fraud that can happen because of AI, because this is the future for next one decade, and therefore spend time on that and look at what needs to change. So the safe and secure AI is extremely important to ensure that we are protected from any kind of a cyber, legal, regulatory attacks. Private is important, which essentially means privacy. Again, how you're dealing with your own information. If you're making use of, say, ChatGPT or any other such tools, what are you sending out becomes important, and therefore have a checks and balances around that, both as individuals as well as an organization today. Third is transparent and explainable, which essentially means that the entire process of how you're doing a decision making, how you're doing an algorithms, how you're doing a correlation, and are there any injections which are happening are extremely important to understand, and there is a need for you to at least catch hold of one of the AI experts who may be there in the IT systems, or hire one to ensure that they are constantly validating it. Just like what you do a maker checker, you should have a checker for whatever is happening in the ecosystem today. Fair and impartial, which means that the outcome which is coming through is a fair outcome and it is not a biased outcome. The other is responsible. Behind this, any implementation today, there has to be an accountable person. And behind any of the output you're talking about, there has to be an accountable person eventually which has to be attached. It cannot be that AI through this. The most common results that, most common reasons that people will say that this was done by AI and therefore I don't know what happened. So that cannot be the answer, and therefore you need to put some mechanisms, policies, governance around that particular part of it. Then we're talking about, again, responsible accountability, Reiki, if you've talked about it as well. But the actions has to be defined and associated with somebody. If AI has thrown a garbage or it is hallucinating, there is a reason for that, and we should be having a mechanism to identify the root cause and pin it down to one of the individuals in the organization today. And obviously we are talking about robust and reliable. All these conversations we already covered in the past. Any questions on this? Happy to answer that right away. I think the mic she's getting it.
See, so there is a difference between AI and ML. So earlier we used to audit AI by putting in, so AI I understand is rule based. You put in certain test data and expect the expected results to see if the decision tree is effectively working, right? Now ML is real-time machine learning which keeps changing the code. So how do we, what kind of test can be done to ensure that the output is, or rather the code which is effectively working is right? Because while you can look at the source, you can look at, I mean now the risk definition also I'm thinking, should it be that the outcome is unbiased? You know, the risk definition itself completely changes. Yeah. So what are the 2-3 ways to test the ML part of the code?
So I think, again, interpretation is slightly different. AI is not only rule-based, because it's slightly more than that. It's more probabilistic driven, correct? So whenever you have a statistical modeling, that's AI, correct? In the machine learning, obviously it's a different mechanism we're trying to use, where you're constantly having a kind of a reinvention of what is there in the machine code, and therefore you change that, correct? So the first thing is to define the risk in a slightly different way, as you rightly said. I cannot look at the risk of if then else. In the earlier stage, it used to be if then else risk, right? And it's exception-based risks. Now today, it's not about exception-based risk. It's about the risk of the overall governance going wrong, and overall kind of a what you call scenario for risk, in this case is bias, right? So for the biases, the way that they are doing it, I'm just giving a plain English language. I'm sure the tech team will do a lot more job on that particular part. But for the biases, what is important is that what is the governance around the models that you're running it, and are there any biases induced in the model? The second is that the sources are authenticated sources on a constant basis, because when I take out any data today, it is based on 2 things. One is I pick up some information. The other is I make a meaningful interpretation of the particular information. So picking up information is a source, meaningful interpretation is a model. So I need to have a strong governance around that to ensure that these 2 are authenticated before it goes into production, and constantly revisited on a periodic basis as well. So this is what is done. But how it is done, I think it depends on what language you're using it, who's the expert. The expert should be able to do that, but somebody has to take that charge on behalf of the risk world or a risk ecosystem. I heard one more question, yeah.
Good morning, sir. My name is Pratish. I had a small doubt when it comes to the use of AI. Like, for example, I don't know about large corporates, but when we go for SME audits, there is no policy as such for the use of AI. Even ChatGPT, Perplexity, whatever it is. So you were talking about the risk of giving out too much information to those, leading to data leak, etc. But when there is no policy at all, and when suppose we are using some sort of AI for bookkeeping or GST, we have to give all the information to that, like GSTN and the names of the vendors, their account numbers, etc., etc. So in such a case, when there is no policy for the SME itself, should we include something like a consent from them in the engagement letter, or how does that work out?
Yeah. So I'll probably keep it generic because I may not know your situation exactly, but in general, one, there has to be policy. There has to be policy and there has to be contractual obligation. At least one of them should always exist. If I'm dealing with a third party, then there has to be contractual obligation. If I'm dealing with my own internal teams and internal access and information from here, or if I'm the one who's employed, then I should be governed by a policy. So that's the kind of a broader context of what you wanted to achieve. So we need to have that. The other thing is that when you're dealing with data, at least the policies of what I'm sending out has to be governed by your own organization as well. And if it is between two entities where I'm giving and making use of AI of a third party, then the third party is accountable to ensure that my personal information, my company's information is not let out. And that should be bound by contract or a policy.
So you mean to say that, suppose I'm engaging some sort of AI for bookkeeping or GST filing or whatever it is, I need to have an agreement with them on an individual basis, in naming the client and all?
If there is a service provider who's providing the service, then obviously you'll have an agreement. If you're making use of just a tool and probably downloading it and using it, one, you'll have to be careful of what tool it is, and is it a kind of a authenticated, authorized tool. Obviously it has to be reliable. Two is that when you're putting certain information in that particular tool, in that particular, if the confidential information there, then obviously you need to be careful about that. You cannot
and I need to get the consent also from the client.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Consent from the client is anyways important in this
case. Nobody talks about the consent part as it's just...
it's extremely important. We've actually been dealing with some of the potentially dispute cases. We anticipate that dispute is going to it's going to go up by roof and it's going to hit the roof in next at least few years. We've already started seeing instances of those where now there are disputes which has been raised because the customer was not consulted before putting things into the AI.
So if we do all this as auditors, we are safe? No, it's a practical...
Yes. Yeah, so the point is that you can never be safe as auditors because eventually something is going to come and hit you. But I'm just saying that you need to put the right kind of guardrails. One of the guardrails is, yes, ensuring that if you're putting out information about anybody, individual as well as the customers, individual for privacy, customers for the confidential data, you need to give consent because it is going out of your ecosystem. If it is not going out of your ecosystem, then it is still bound by your confidentiality clauses as well.
Thank you, sir.
I just have 10 minutes. I'll probably cover some parts of more and then probably we'll open it up for some more questions if there is a time. Now this talks about, so we talked about one of the aspects. This is just one example of how a millennial is going to have a different world because he's dealing with different world in terms of the data and in terms of the technologies. One, obviously we talked about AI. I just loosely use word AI. It can be AI, ML, it can be Gen AI as well. The other part is that identity. Because you're dealing with an ecosystem environment where my identity is not known, I'm only known by not Arjun, but I'm known by my phone. I'm known by my SIM card. I'm known by my IMEI number, which is my phone. So therefore, this becomes an extremely important factor, especially in a environment like digital payments, e-commerce, or anything where the customer is only interfacing with you and you don't know the face of the customers, except for the KYC that you do, rest all transaction happens on the network. So there, the bigger risk that we have seen is obviously device fingerprinting becomes an extremely important parameter, that am I able to identify that this particular device, and when I say device, it is not about only the IMEI, because the device can be spoofed as well, the device can be changed as well, I can do a reset, I can do a lot of things to probably come back into the network and show that it's a different person. But that's why the fingerprinting becomes important, because multiple characteristics of a devices or what I do on a devices can tell me that this is the same guy who's come back. So that is one part that is important. The other is the behavioral analysis becomes important because that's what will tell me that the same mannerism exhibited seems to be for the right kind of a guy and this is a genuine guy and not a bot. So if I'm doing a transaction at a velocity which is not humanly possible, that is one of the behavioral aspect. Right? If I'm changing my devices and if I'm there in multiple networks and multiple locations within a span of time, which is say a few seconds, then that's a behavioral aspect. The other is that if I'm doing a phishing fraud and if I'm asking people for password and putting it, and it is not my natural password speed, then I would know that, okay, if I put the password, I'm putting it at a particular speed. If somebody is taking password from me, putting it, he'll put it different speed, and therefore you should be able to differentiate that. That is another kind of a behavior aspect which people are now able to find out and tell also. When I'm putting a password, am I still on call? Can be identified. And therefore that becomes a behavioral part of it. So these are the things which you are trying to talk about, which happens as a part of the behavioral analysis. And obviously there are other aspects and characteristics as well, which is to do with transaction. But largely we are talking about these two as areas which will change. And therefore we need to watch out for that and keep a governance around that. Now, how does the device fingerprinting happen? Again, in the world of frauds today, the biggest fraud which happens today is around the phishing frauds, payment frauds, e-commerce frauds, return frauds, and collusions, and therefore device fingerprinting, gaming frauds, money laundering. So these are the places where we are seeing that device fingerprinting becomes extremely important, and this is one of the governance we are talking about. Key is everybody has a platform. The platform talks about rules, platform talks about transactions to be monitored, which is there in the system. What's changing is that how do I identify a particular user? And we spoke about some of those examples. Now the governance around a particular user becomes extremely important. And this is like an SDK. You are able to get maximum information about it, including the resets. If I'm using an app or if I'm using any kind of a software which is going to probably mask my IP, that will also be identified. If I have a software which is going to uninstall my security parameters, that will also be highlighted. If I'm using my phone screens, for example, if I'm having a particular preference for my screen to be at 8 out of 10 in terms of brightness, it is able to map all those things to figure out that, okay, whenever this combination comes in, it is always Arjun. So even if I change my phones or even if I change my SIMs, it is able to still tie back to me and say, this is the same guy who's come back as well. So this is what our technology is now enabled by the so-called millennials and Gen Zs. So while there are fraudsters who are also millennials and Gen Zs, but this is now happening and probably much more in a much more evolved and a better way. And contribution again is coming from the millennials and Gen Zs. Now I'm just starting with, are millennials really the issue, which is what we started off with, right? So one is obviously we see that the frauds is happening across, and we've shown you some of the at least insights about what the fraud survey says. The Gen Zs and baby boomers, which is largely people who are 40 to 70, right? They do more of a traditional corporate frauds, and that is largely to do with, say, more management overrides. When you talk about millennials, it's a band. You start the band of, say, 35 and upward, they are still the people who are in a senior level influential positions or they are founders, and they end up doing frauds which can be potentially similar corporate frauds. Anything which is below that are the people who are more youngsters today evolving, and they are much more adept in terms of online ecosystems, and therefore the frauds which are happening is around the online space of it, which can be fraud, wastage and abuse, gig economy, which is what they are getting into. Gen Zs, which are the ones which are to watch out for, they're much more ahead of us in terms of their ability to use the newer technologies, so-called, which you're talking about, referring to today. And therefore, the kind of fraud that they may inflict in future is going to be to do with, say, the identity frauds, AI frauds, Gen AI frauds, and therefore watch out for that. So it's a mix of all. It is not about what is the age group or what is the persona. It is about what kind of frauds are inflicted over there. What is important here is that the victims are also the millennials. The victims are also the same set of people who are on the other side of the table. Third is obviously it's the technology evolution which is leading to a different risk more than the personas. So I would like to probably sum it up for this current presentation. One is we started off with a millennial. What we are saying is that focus on behavior-based personas and not demographic-based personas. Because even if I say the millennial does it, I cannot put a check and balance on millennials, right? I need to put a check and balance on the behavior aspects of the millennials. Second is have an ethics and integrity governance framework. Just like what you have today, that there is a policies in place for what has to be done by the employees, what has to be followed by the employees. You need to have a very similar policies and frameworks to govern the new age HRs or say human resources, which is nothing but your new personas, which can be AI and bot. Treat them like an employee, treat them like a what you call as people and see what they can do, and the same has to be then applied in terms of the policies to be put around them as well. The last is watch out for the hidden identities, which is where we are talking about that it is not the people. You will not be able to know that this is Arjun who's behind it. It can be anybody, and that anybody today is exhibited by the mobile or a devices or any other way of connecting. Watch out for that is what I would want to sum up with. Thank you for your time. Any questions? Happy to answer that. Yeah.
Hello. Sir, my question is a bit layered. I have 2-3 layers in the particular question.
Yeah.
So if you see in Israel, we saw a pager attack. And then you see everyone speaks about a backdoor entry. I understand this, all the software lies on a hardware. So everyone is talking about this backdoor entry for which Huawei is banned from US. Now we have our fingerprints, everything which are linked going to UIDA server through fingerprints and other things. How do I ensure my biometric system doesn't have a backdoor? Is there any certification or something? And also that our companies does not have that bandwidth to verify does a particular software has a backdoor or not. How do we ensure this?
What's a backdoor, and understand the backdoor entry you're referring to?
So in a, when we have this layers in the, layers when we see the physical layer or a network layer or a data link layer. So they say the physical layer always might have a backdoor.
7 layers you're referring to?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, okay. What does a pager to do with it? I don't understand the pager question.
No, it's basically that we were able to attack something.
Okay, so okay. Got it.
In the same way, when we are transmitting our biometric or authentication, it doesn't have a backdoor and it doesn't steal the data which is being transmitted.
So I think obviously it's best answered by a guy who's more cyber in nature. I'm still a more forensic, generic, techno-functional guy. But what I understand is that the controls at each of the 7 layers are defined, and there are standards to define that as well, right? For example, in a SS7 signaling, there is a control which is there in place, correct? When you're transmitting any of the information, it is transmitted in the form of a package, which cannot be unpacked unless until you go to the upward of the layers. In the SS7 signaling, you will not be able to catch that, correct? So therefore, in this particular case of, say, you asked about Aadhaar, obviously it's something which Aadhaar has to answer that, but what we understand is that I think there are enough controls which are there at each of these layers as a technology, and therefore the data that you're giving today is secured unless somebody intentionally takes out data, which can happen at any point in time. That's where the entire anti-fraud initiative.
So in case of Aadhaar, I understand that. Yeah. Let's say as a company, I'm getting their biometric data and storing it for attendance or whatever.
Yeah.
During that time, do you feel the company has a bandwidth to understand this risk?
Yes, I think they should be, because there's a dedicated team of, say, CISOs as well as a dedicated team of IT InfoSec, which they're supposed to do this job. That's their main job, especially banking, especially telecom. These are the places where everything is going to be anyways taken care of, correct? So that's there, and I think I'm just giving very simple example, DLP, but there are more complicated set of say tools and technology which are existing over there to ensure that no data comes in, no data goes out, which are not authorized, right from firewall to whatever breaks which are there in place.
Thank you, sir.
You can call me Arjun, no, it's not needed, sir. I'm still a millennial, yeah.
Hey, good morning. So we talked about the bias aspect, right?
Yeah.
So we always try to criticize AA from being very judgmental, right? As if we are not. So, okay. The point is, we are talking about the human bias and risk exceptions, right? So there is something called as a normalcy bias. So what we think is like, we focus only on those risks that we understand. But we underestimate those risks which we're not aware of or we're not probable of, right?
Yeah.
So point is like we take for granted tomorrow will also be like today. That's a normalcy bias. And if you really look at some of the classical, the real time attacks that we saw, for example, right? let's say for example, the digital disruption related issues, like what CrowdStrike did, resulting in, IT outages, impacting hospitals, travels and all those stuff. And for that case, even geopolitical issues. For example, the
Sabotage.
Israeli-Ukraine war they're talking. So we are not able to predict about it, right? Now, when we start building all these aspects into AI, so do we see a scenario wherein actually it will also end up having a normalcy bias, because already we are criticizing it for judgment. So what will happen? It will also start inheriting that normalcy bias, or it will have the capability to say, okay, there is going to be something of this nature that is going to happen at any point of time.
Unanticipated one.
Yeah.
So I think very interesting story. I think what you're referring to can be looked at it from a slightly different lens also. And what we used to call it as familiarity breeds contempt. Similarly, normalcy leads to the same thing, right? You take granted that the position remains the same. So one example that we quoted as a very broad, unrelated one is, say, when Headley was here, he was able to get a lot of arms and ammunitions into his room, especially because you come here every day, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, the guard sees you, 6th day he sees you, 7th day you're friendly to him, you're talking to him, 8th day he stops checking you, correct? Because he's got so used to you, and in his mind he's made an assumption that you are not going to do anything which is going to be probably of impacting the national interest, because, or say impacting the security for that particular security guard. Same is the case with, say, when somebody does a guard checking. So and I used to drive in my car and then he'll open the bonnet, look at it and then close it, assuming that the bomb will always be there in the bonnet and it will be written bomb, correct? And I asked him the question also that what will you do if you find the bomb? And I would have probably loved to say it in Hindi because that's how he said it, but largely he said that if I see it, I'll just drop it and run away because that's what I'm paid for, correct? I cannot do beyond that. It's not a national interest for me. But long story short is that the normalcy is the one which is going to be the biggest risk for us, because we take things granted and we only look at the risks which we've anticipated today. AI can enable that anticipation to go better, which is what we're trying to do, and ensuring that we are able to predict certain risks, which is where the predictive analytics comes in. At the same time, there's a risk that if you're not governing AI, then this risk will go unnoticed and it will again get back to the normalcy. So the constant check on the models, constant check on how we are able to recalibrate is extremely important, because my prediction is based on what is happening in the past. So empirical evidence is one part of it, but what can happen in the future is something which has to be modeled in as well. So that's
exactly.
The way it's
point
working.
is, right, when you started this session, you started with the example of the jewelry issue, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's a behavioral aspect.
Normalcy issue, yeah.
So that's where I'm coming in. And
Yes.
again, AI is a classical example of Gen Z.
Yes, yes. But again, I don't want to paint all the Gen Zs into the same category. Just like I was unhappy, maybe some Gen Z will be unhappy, because some people are also preventing it as well. But yeah, that was also normalcy issue. So you look at any big fraud which has happened, it will always get to a situation of normalcy where people are used to it, comfortable, and then it happens. So therefore, watching out for normalcy is very important. Yeah.
Question?
Yeah, sorry.
Financial and non-financial we used to keep separate, except for cash and person. Nothing else we will be carrying. Now social media and financial, everything we are doing in mobile or laptop, everything is mixed up now. Even our wealth and normal cash transactions, everything under one roof we are. That is more prone to fraud. Correct. Fraud has reached this much mass level, maybe because of that. If we can address that issue to segregate some way. Like earlier when smartphones were introduced, people used to have two phones, one for financial transaction and another for social media. Now we don't have choice, one we have to use all.
True, but I think at individual level it makes a huge sense, because we've seen cases where because you're keeping the same thing in the same phone, your confidential information has got leaked. The organizations are able to at least manage that better, because they're able to create a separate, I would say, a partition, and that partition is secluded and secured based on whatever the standard that they apply, so that at least that their data is secure today.
Right. Yeah. From banking sector, so I may say that now even marketing or banking, it is interlinked only. Everything goes back to that core banking only.
Correct.
That
So,
segregation also is not there in organization level.
yeah, so I think we've seen a slightly different one. We'll be happy to come and help you so that that is much more secure. So, but otherwise, I think as individual levels, if there is no partitions and there is no guardrails put, yes, I think that's a place. But there are mechanisms to put that guardrail in place, and therefore it can be saved. I
Yeah,
think
the
there's
one last
question from
question.
that can be the last
sure.
question. Yeah.
So, hi Arjun, this is Rangesh. So, you were, when you were presenting, there was one slide which said remote work was the largest contributor to fraud.
Sorry?
Remote work was the largest contributor.
One of the largest, as a survey, yeah.
Yeah, through the Deloitte survey.
Yeah.
So, if I take example of moonlighting or payroll frauds,
Yeah.
how do you envision this being reduced, or even if a company supports remote work, which is the way forward as well, which most corporates do, how do I ensure as an auditor, as an internal audit function as well, to ensure that people who work remotely do not foresee such risks, or do not have other jobs or do such frauds?
Okay. So now the organizations are doing few things and basic things also, correct? So one is change your metrics from, and I'm talking about the non-tech and I'll come to the tech later, change your metrics from say hours spent to outcome driven as much as possible. That's number one. Two is give him enough work that he is busy and he has to complete the work in that day. Correct? And it really works beautifully. Keep them so much busy that they don't have time for doing any other work. Right? So that's the second part of it. These are actually organizations doing that extensively today to ensure that they're not spending too much of a money in identifying moonlighting. They'd rather spend that money somewhere else, but ensure that the guy is given enough work that he's busy. That's one part of it. But coming to the tech, now there are various at least smaller tech initiatives which has come to the company, and not everybody is adopting the kind of most complex one. The one is that there's a liveliness test that I'm sitting there and constantly working on my laptop. That's number one. Number two, it is able to identify that what are the meaningful applications that I'm working on. So if I'm sitting in front of my computer watching a YouTube or opening some kind of app which is or not probably for the company's purposes, it should be able to differentiate and tell me that it is only the meaningful app. There is some line that we need to draw about, say, privacy, correct? But having said that, this part of it of saying that the guy is active, there's a liveliness, there's a consent being taken for that as well, and he's using the application which are prescribed by the company on a constant basis. Add to that, there's an output which you're talking about. That's what is now people doing to ensure that he's constantly in front of his laptop working on apps which are relevant in nature. And they're able to now track saying that in a day, 8 hours of meaningful app, including say Word, PPT and others. What does he do in that particular Word obviously is a question mark, but he's able to go to that extent as well. But key part is that keep the KPIs in such a way that it is measurable outcome that you can derive, rather than saying that how much of time is he spending. The other is there's a lot of other external information which is available today, and probably we can discuss in detail, where I will be able to figure out that this guy is working somewhere else. So that's also being used, but it depends on where is he working. If he's working as a driver, then we should not be able to find out. But if he's working in some other IT company in a legit manner, we should be able to figure out. So those things are there in place.
So thank you, Arjun, for
Thank you.
this enlightening session. I think the audience was completely engrossed in whatever you had
Thanks a lot.
said. So on behalf of IIM Madras chapter and all the participants here, we thank you for this presentation and request our BOG, Mr. Padmanabhan, to hand over a memento on behalf of the IIM Madras chapter. Thank you.